I think so. Hey everybody, and happy Wednesday. I'm here with Brigids Gate Press, and we are celebrating the anniversary of A Man in Winter that was written by Katie Marie. You guys know me, Amy. I do and assist on the marketing and the PR for Brigids Gate Press and all of their authors. And I have so much fun. You only see me at the party time because I'm the party person. So I'm so excited to be able to host this for you guys and to celebrate and this anniversary with you guys. And so with all that being said, I'm going to mute myself and let everybody else introduce themselves.
Okay, Katie, let's start with you since you're the author.
Oh no. Hi, my name is Katie Marie. I am indeed the author of A Man in Winter. I tend to describe myself as a horror enthusiast before a writer because I have a minor obsession with the horror genre, she says with a guilty expression. And that's pretty much me in a nutshell. I am currently working on a new novella which is very much a work in progress at the moment. And that's pretty much me in a nutshell. It's exciting.
All right, then we can just go around the room. Steph, you want to go next? And then we'll do Paul and Kev.
Okay, I'm Stephanie Ellis. I write dark fiction and dark poetry. I've got the folk horror novels, I will say, Five Turns of the Wheel and Reborn Out with Brigids Gate Press, and I'm currently working on the third one, which is set around Yule and deep midwinter, although I could do with a bit of sun right now. A couple of poetry collections, Foundlings and Lilith Rising. And my current work in progress, which I'm having to get on with, is creating a online workshop about sacrifice in folk horror. So watching lots of films and reading lots of books. So 101 Ways to Die in Folk Horror, and that's me.
Paul, you next. How about? Hi, Mickey.
Hi. Sorry I'm late, everybody.
Hi, I'm Paul. I'm Kate's partner. I'm a writer in my own right. I write science fiction, fantasy. I've just finished a project, so I'm querying at the moment.
Okay.
Excellent. Kev, how about you?
Yeah, so I'm Kev Harrison. I've got a novella out by on Brigids Gate Press roster called Below, which is a subterranean horror thing. I've also got a folk horror novella called The Balance from a few years ago, and I have a novel coming out next year, short novel with Brigids Gate Press as well, called Shadow of the Hidden, which I'm very excited about as well.
All right, Mickey, you're up.
Hi, I'm Mickey Mickelson. I am the sole publicist for Brigids Gate Press. I represent a substantial number of authors worldwide in all genres, and just very, very excited to be here today.
Excellent. And I want to mention really quick that Steph has book coming out on August 1st, The Woodcutter. Just in a few days. And it's available for pre-sale on Amazon right now. So, and I also want to mention that Katie's book is on sale right now. The ebook on Amazon is on sale for 99 cents, and the paperback is on sale for $5.99 USD, and will be for a week. Oh, Cindy, hi. So we'll have it on sale for the next week, so you've got plenty of time to go and grab it. And so usually how we start these, we could do some giveaways. You want to do it on Twitter?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And maybe Threads.
Yeah, maybe Threads.
Yeah.
I was just telling her, watch our space, because as part of Katie's anniversary celebration, there will be some giveaways.
Yeah.
And we'll be announcing those through the coming week, so be watching for them.
And you guys know I love to sneak in other books that I've read recently with our giveaways. So usually we start these shindigs with me sharing the passage of the book where I hear my mom start narrating the story. So when we were growing up, my sister and I, my mother read to us every night, and up until our teen years, and it didn't matter how late she came home from work, if she had strep throat, if she was tired, we were merciless. And we would beg for chapter after chapter, and she'd do all the voices and she would just read until she couldn't read anymore. And so stories get greenlit by me as soon as my mother starts narrating them in my head. And we've had one book where it was at the very last chapter.
Yeah.
But some of them, it can be the first line or nestled in the first, 20 pages. But that's when the story starts to become real to me, and I can really like imagine the whole story as it unfolds. And so this is the, I'm pretty sure this is it. It may have been edited a little since the original, but I blinked as my vision faltered. I wasn't at home in the cottage. I was in the new bungalow. Molly wasn't safe. She was over a year dead. But in my hands, I clutched her pink dressing gown, bloodstained and smelling of her. And that was it for me, is the moment where our main character really struggles with the reality of his wife's death. And the story, it's a hard story to classify because it's definitely a horror story, because anybody who's had to deal with a loved one who has dementia knows that that is a true life horror story. But it's also a mystery. It's a whodunit where he's trying to find, I don't think it's a spoiler to say his wife died in a crime, right?
Right, I think it's mentioned
in the back.
Yeah.
So, but we may do some spoilers. I'm going to try not to, but his wife has passed on. She's murdered in a home invasion, and it's a whodunit, but he's also racing his own dementia.
Yeah.
And so, it's an interesting story because it's got a little bit psychological horror, a little bit whodunit, a little bit quiet horror, a little bit just horror. So it's hard to really, when you go into a bookstore and you're trying to look for where you would find it, you could find it in any of those places.
Well, it's definitely quiet horror. I would agree with that. But like you're saying, is it psychological horror? Is this a ghost story?
Ghost story. That's how I first started plugging it as a ghost story, because Molly's such a character in the story. But Katie, what I want to know is, what was your inspiration for art, or what made you want to delve into the idea of a character who was struggling with dementia? Uh-oh, we can't hear you.
We can't hear you.
Uh-oh.
No, we can't hear you.
Oh no, and it worked just fine.
There you go.
There
I had a little button and I hadn't pushed it because I'm a computer genius, obviously. So to answer your question, I used to work in the legal profession a long time ago, and I dealt with a lot of people who were in the very early stages of dementia, and they were sorting out powers of attorney, they were sorting out wills, all these things. And these people were just so different from the kind of dementia characters that you would see in particularly horror stories. In horror stories, generally, someone with dementia is either something to be feared, they're the thing we all run away from, or they are like super vulnerable and they lose all agency completely. And it's, sorry, my cat's being a pain in the bum. Mia, you wee devil. So art came from sort of like an amalgamation of all these people that I had been seeing and talking to, and they all had one thing in common, and that was that they weren't that worried about themselves. There was obviously an element of fear for their own well-being in there, but the main thing that they were concerned about was their family. What was going to happen when they no longer recognized the people who they loved, and what was going to happen when they no longer recognized themselves, and how tragic that was going to be for the people that they were effectively leaving behind. Like we all worry to an extent about what's going to happen to our family after we're no longer here, but what happens to our family when we're no longer here, but we are still physically here? And that's very much where art came from.
I think that is really the true horror of a dementia diagnosis. Both of my grandmothers had dementia at the end of their lives. My maternal, my maternal grandmother had it for several years. And for the most part, other than a few outbursts, which is kind of normal with the diagnosis, she was it seemed like a pleasant place to be in her head. You know, she was always she was a reader. So she would much rather read books than go to a party. But I kind of explained her personality as a ladies' luncheon personality. You know, she was just kind of that pleasant ladies' luncheon tea kind of person. And so her dementia, and she lived in Texas, so I didn't deal with her day to day, but hers seemed much gentler than my paternal's grandmother, who we lived next door to for 7.5 years and were caretakers for. And she only lived with dementia that we were aware of
for maybe a year.
And really closer to 7 months, because as it turns out, while my grandfather was alive, he hid it from us. So those were days that he would cancel because he didn't feel well, were days that grandma couldn't quite put her finger on who she was. And so we were all surprised when my grandfather passed away and grandma would have these days that made no sense. And we're like, wow, grandpa died and grandma's lost it. And then I was like, really? Or did grandpa hide it? Was this their best kept secret? But the character art is so real, having lived with somebody with dementia now, which I hadn't before we published the story. Art is so believable to me in this story after watching my grandmother really grapple with it. Oh, you're right. A year. Yeah. A year and a half. Really grapple with it. Especially the last 6 months when it got really bad, because she really believed the things that she was saying. Before we went live, I was telling the story of, I went over there one day and she was very upset and distraught and didn't know what she was going to do because she believed she had killed a man. And it was inspired by something she had seen on the news that morning. Right. And she had internalized it and thought she was the guilty party, and she was needing to go to court and to meet with the DA, and she didn't know where her lawyer was, but it was so real.
Yeah, and she would call us at 2 a.m. Letting us know that the police were coming.
The sheriff was on his way.
The sheriff was on his way to get her. We needed to get bail money for her.
And called the lawyer.
Yeah.
It was really rough at the end, but so the story that I was really intrigued by became very real, because in the story, you can't convince Art he isn't seeing Molly and that he isn't tracking down Molly's killers, and that this isn't completely logical and making total sense to him. And it's so believable in the way that you've written it that I'm like, wow, dementia is wild. And then my grandmother went through a period where she thought we had exhumed my grandfather, and he had come, that he was there, that she had hid him in the room because she didn't want us to get in trouble for exhuming a dead body. And so I was like, well, show me where he is and I'll take him back to the graveyard, because I couldn't convince her that he wasn't alive or he wasn't there. And we went through several periods like that where she would say, well, Grandpa was here last night. And you could not convince her it was a ghost. Yeah. She was like, no, it was Grandpa. Grandpa was here. And it was so real. And it's just like it's written here. It's real. And
it's one of the things I love about the story is, as you go through it, even at the very end, you're not sure.
Yeah.
Is everything just in Art's mind?
Don't give too much away now.
I won't go anything specific, but is this his dementia? Is there something more going on? Is there really a ghost? Did this really
Do you
happen?
remember how mad the reviewers were in the beginning with the end? We got a couple of reviewers who was like, is there going to be like an epilogue when we were sending it out for beta readers? And they're like, is there going to be an epilogue where we know what really happened? And I'm like, no, that's the story. That's the story. That's the best part of the story. And they were like, no, I need to know. But yeah.
Yeah.
So you said something very interesting that I think is very true. And that is, in horror especially, people who have an illness or mental illness, or are different in any way, are often portrayed as the villains in horror instead of the hero of the story in horror. And art is really the hero of this story. I mean, maybe not so much to his daughter, but you know, but to, you know, he's the one who's solving the crime and saving his wife, and so that's different, because I think there is a tendency, not just in horror but in other genres, to paint anybody who's different as the villain. Like the Hunchback is the classic villain, and you know, anybody who has any kind of difference. And so that's one of the things I really enjoyed about the story, and I'd like to see more of, I think, in horror, is anybody, regardless of why they're different, being the kind of hero of the story instead of the villain of the story. And I was just having
or the victim.
Right, or the victim of the story. And I was having a conversation with another author a couple weeks ago who was like, I'm tired of the lesbian always being the victim. Why is the gay character never the hero? Why are they always the villain or the victim? And I'm like, well, that's a good question.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. But it's interesting. What, you have a question?
So what are some of y'all's thoughts on that?
On villainizing the different.
As far as mental disorders, psychological disorders, and whether or not they're the villain or the hero or whatever.
It's actually something that I'm super passionate about, is showing voices that you might not normally hear, especially in a heroic role, because as we said, they are often either the villain of the piece, the thing to be feared, or like an uber victim. They're either like a predator or so fragile they can't possibly exist outside of what they are. And yeah, it is something that I'm trying to incorporate a lot more into my writing. I'm trying to be really conscious of who do I put in the lead role in the stories that I'm telling, and is there a way I could tell this same story but from a different perspective? Usually somebody with, for example, like mental health is a big bugbear of mine, neurodiversity, all this stuff. I'm like super to say I'm super into it, it sounds so weird, but sounds a bit wrong. But I know what I mean by saying I'm super into something is that I'm very passionate about it. I'm very big on making sure that representation is the only word I can think for it is like it's real, it's substantial, it's people are more than their disability, they're like a facet of their identity. There's a lot more to be had, and I think that fiction in particular will benefit from a wider range of perspectives, and especially in the horror genre, which is a bit notorious for keeping our perspectives incredibly narrow. We need to widen this. It would be so much cooler.
I agree. And Steph, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't you work with, in America, we would call them exceptional children, at one point in your previous career?
I worked with what they call special needs here in this country, although in a way that's come to represent, people think kids who have difficulties, although special needs in effect really encompasses those who are at the other end of the scale and need more support because they're very high flying. But those that I worked with, they were amongst some of the most challenging students, the most vulnerable students because of their backgrounds. And I would find that the nature of their difficulties was often masked by behavior. And then from then on, from an early age, I mean, I dealt with teens up to about the age of 16, and their behavior defined them, and teachers would respond to the behavior and not to what the actual problem was. I would work with them one-to-one or within small groups, and I would talk to them about their backgrounds. You just get to know them, and then you realize that there are other issues underneath that then trigger that bit, that trigger the behavior, because they're masking all the difficulties that they've had that no one's ever addressed, no one's taken the time to deal with. And then those difficulties, those issues in turn lead to mental health issues later on. It's an extremely high proportion. And I'm someone, I mean, recent years I've started talking out more on podcasts and interviews and things, but I hate speaking publicly. When I was in the school, we'd have we'd have meetings in the staff room sort of once a week or whatever. And I wouldn't want to speak in front of them. But I remember my boss, he said, we're going to do something on speech, language and communication. And would I do a presentation on it? Because I was the sort of specialist in that role. So I did that and identified various students. But I said I'd do it because I'd got so worked up about it, because there were some students who were about to leave school and they were clearly part of the speech and language issue remit. And at the end of that talk, I said, I just showed them on the board and I said, we failed them. I said nothing else. With all the others, I said, well, we'll do this, 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 this. And then I just showed them and I said, we failed them. And you could have cut the atmosphere with a knife then. And I left. I said, oh, the head's not going to speak to me. But I felt so bad for those kids, because in all the work that I've done and the studies I've done and seeing what their future life chances were, the proportion of especially young men who would end up in prison, the young offenders, it was very, very high. It was anything from sort of 70-80%. It was those difficulties, that their learning difficulties led to this, so you'd have mental health, you'd have homelessness, you'd have prison records, and so much because nobody had spent the time with them when they were younger to unpick those issues. So yeah, I felt guilty when I left the school because the kids I worked with, and I still do to a certain extent. And I see in society, people will label criminals because they've done this, but they don't see what's behind it. So I would never say, oh, it's an excuse, but we need to look more at the reasoning. So there is that aspect of how the early years are extremely important, and in secondary schools, and even they've got to spend the time with the kids, not just look at targets and statistics and exam passes. Those don't mean anything if you haven't got a child who's nurtured, who's looked after, who's understood. And yeah, it just got to me that I really enjoyed that. I loved that work. I loved working with the kids, even when they drove me up the wall. But they were great with me. But you try and protect them. That's one thing I always did, though, was if they were in trouble, if they did cause trouble, I said, right, I've got to report this. But then again, if they were in trouble and they hadn't done anything, or they needed some sort of support, then I would stand in their corner so they knew that I was fair. But it was a tough job, but enjoyable. And there's still so many out there. It's just
There is, and I've noticed. I mean, I think even we had a social worker that I know who did the sensitivity read for A Man in Winter, and she was very impressed. She's like, this is very spot on. This kind of, confusion about where you are, and the kind of, there's a scene where the bungalow is disheveled, like somebody's broken in and rifled through things. And she's like, this is a great scene because somebody with dementia can do this to their own home and not remember doing it and not think that they've done it, and will be like, somebody's broken in, somebody has stolen something, or vandals were here just ripping stuff up, or a gang of kids came through and ripped everything up. And so so she was really impressed with that particular part of the book, because she's like, this happens all the time in my line of work. Like, we see this kind of thing all the time. And then we see family becoming so angry because there are all these false alarms, especially if the person's still like living at home alone and they're calling the police and making a police report. And it's turned out that they're the ones who have taken everything out in the kitchen. And so then the sheriff's got to notify next of kin, right, something's not right. And, it's a big mess here in the States. But there is this kind of stigmatism to dementia, I think, everywhere. And people, when they don't understand it, become very impatient with it. And, you know, we saw it within our own family, how we definitely had a very quick learning curve. And, you know, some of us didn't learn as fast as others. And so they had a tendency to take it very personally and accuse her of being manipulative or lying on purpose. And it was very difficult for them to come to terms with the fact that that it wasn't that she really believed somebody had broken in and rifled through all of her things. And she really believed, she believed a lot of horrible things. Yeah. I'm suddenly remembering and wishing I didn't. But yeah, she believed she was a victim of a lot of different crimes. And, but I mean, truthfully, honestly believed it. And it reminds me very much of, because we raise children who are exceptional children. And it reminds me very much of helping them through social situations where it's difficult with their peers who don't understand why they act or respond in a certain way, and with teachers who don't understand, or other adults who don't understand why they react or respond in a certain way. And and boy, I mean, early intervention is important. Steph, I would agree with you. It's a mess when they're 16 and you're just trying to peel it back because, you know, you're under such pressure to help them get it right before they're 18 and it counts, you know, and will be held against them forever. But it's interesting. But what do you want to say?
Well, it was going to be changing.
Okay, go ahead. I'm ready.
I was going to go back to the book itself and had a question for Katie. Now, I know as the author, of course, you love your own work, but is there a particular part of, I mean, you love the whole thing is what I'm trying to say. Is there a particular part of Man in Winter that stands out for you? I mean, as the writer?
A scene?
A particular scene or what?
Yes, yeah, there is. And I think I can probably get away with this without too many spoilers. So there's spoiler warning. The favorite scene for me, the one I had, saying I had the most fun writing it is probably not the right word, but the one I really enjoyed writing the most was when Molly is leading Art out of the bungalow and into the town, and he just follows her, so much so that he forgets to put on shoes and he's just walking into town, and he gets quite a substantial way before he's like, shit, my feet hurt, and has to get into a taxi. And he's automatically thinking, right, I know this looks weird, I know this is odd, how do I blag this with this taxi driver? And the fact that in his either in his mind or maybe the ghost of his wife, you're never supposed to know, even I don't know, could be anything, never know, is giving him directions effectively in the back seat, like even when she's dead, she's backseat driving, and even Art doesn't know where it is he's going. And when they get out of the taxi and he's like, I have no clue where I am, and he knows that he doesn't know where he is, but he knows it's where he's supposed to be. And I really enjoyed writing that scene. That was
a good
cool.
scene.
It was very powerful.
Yeah, that was a good scene. And it's so real. You know, I mean, I remember Grandma would mutter to Grandpa sometimes, who had been dead for a year. And she would just be like trying to play it really low key because she was with 12 of us and not all of us believed he was there. You know, and so she'd be like, Bill, we'll talk about it later.
And I'm going to try to avoid spoilers. I'm not going to say anything specific, but referring to that scene itself, that's one of the parts that I thought you did a really good job of throwing a lot of doubt in there as to what's going on, because yes, he has no idea where he's at, but then when what happens after that, it makes you wonder, okay, well, maybe Molly is real. Maybe Molly was there and she led him, because how would he know to be here?
Right. Maybe this really is a ghost story. So. Yeah.
Like maybe he's meant to be there, or maybe it's just like a weird coincidence. You don't know.
Exactly.
Spooky noises.
I love that about ghost stories. And I love that. The other thing I love about A Man in Winter is that I know I'm going to get this reputation, but I love it when atmosphere kind of feels like its own character.
Yeah.
And in that particular scene, you know, like he's barefoot and it's cold, and he's like, okay, wait. You know what? He may not be cold. I imagined him cold. Like, I'm barefoot and cold. My feet are cold. And, but it's that kind of atmospheric, it feels heavy. You know what I mean? That he's arrived to this place and he doesn't really know where he is or why he's gone to this place. So it has the whole scene kind of is shrouded in this heaviness. And there are a few other scenes in the book that are kind of shrouded in this heaviness where it's almost like a fog. When I read it, I imagine it like, oh, it must be foggy and rainy out, clearly, because this is a heavy part of the book. And it kind of reminds me of Kev's story Below, where it's just very, you know, there's that atmospheric weight to parts of the book where you're like, whoa, whoa. I mean, I don't like to be in caves or mines or anything else, but it is, I do want to talk for a minute about atmosphere, because I think atmosphere is a big part of really any story, but especially in the horror genre.
Well, let me interject one
Okay,
thing
you go
here,
ahead.
that if the character in Below was anything like you, there would have been no story.
Yeah.
Like,
Page
cave,
3.
Nope.
Page
There's
3,
something
the
else
story
down
is
the
over.
road we're going to go see.
Yeah, no.
I mean, to be clear, if it was anything like me, it would have been over in 3 pages as well.
Yeah, like,
Definitely.
no, that's it. What an interesting thing to find by an ancestor. I'm not going there. I am not going underground.
Yeah.
Steph, you'd be proud of me. I'm making peace with all the trees at our new house. And I mean, like, they are everywhere. There's almost no natural light in this house. And because you have to go to the middle of the backyard to see the sky, and there's a small spat. I chose this room. My office is set up in our dining room because I can see 3 small patches of sky from this window through the trees. Because I've got a thing about trees and atmosphere too.
And Steph, you've seen some of my big sky pictures that I've posted.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have that opportunity anymore. I walk outside, it's just trees.
We live in an old neighborhood, so all the trees are 100 to 50 years old, and they're tall, and also why we had no power for so long. But we're out of the big wide open spaces of the country for sure. Yeah. It's nothing but trees here, but there is an atmosphere, like whether it's woods or, you know, a creepy mine, but you can create atmosphere in like the urban setting, you know, like when I imagined him in town, barefoot, in a cab, going to buildings, I'm like, I don't know. I just felt like that was creepy as hell. And so, but it was the buildup. It was the description of the scene. Mm-hmm. So I want to talk about atmosphere and what do you guys think about the importance of atmosphere? Specifically, maybe in horror, but also in science fiction, in fantasy
in any genre. Really.
I can't remember the name of the book I just read, but we had a moment in that book where the atmosphere was so thick. I was like, oh, the atmosphere needs a name. It's a character. So you guys do it. Anybody can talk. Anybody dive in.
Well, I'm not sure if it ties into atmosphere, but I always really like it when I can try and make the setting its own character. The novella I'm writing at the moment, its working title is just called The House, because that's where it's set, in this house. You don't leave the house in the whole of the story, but the house itself needs to be its own character. It needs to be oppressive and imprisoning, and like there is, again, no spoilers because it doesn't actually technically exist yet in the wide world. But outside the windows, by the 3rd chapter, outside the windows of this house, there is literally the void. There is nothing outside this house. It's black. And I think it's really important, again, in all sorts of genres, to have the setting and the atmosphere be its own intense presence, almost like a character in and of itself. I find Neil Gaiman's really good at doing that in his work. He's I think it's Neverwhere, the one that's set in London, particularly on like the underground and whatnot. And London itself is its own character in the book, and it's so cool. And I really, really hope one day I can get like anywhere near that good at crafting cool character settings. Yes.
So what about you, Paul or Kev? One of you go first. Atmosphere in a book. Is it like another character to you as you're writing it? Whether it's setting or atmosphere. I always call it atmosphere. I never use the word setting.
Right.
I'm not a true literary person, clearly. I just publish them.
Do you want to go, Paul, for a different perspective from a sci-fi angle?
It can be tricky with sci-fi because you're trying to invoke a very different style of atmosphere. You're trying to sort of create sort of sensations of wonder and speculation and whatnot, rather than any sort of persistent heavy atmosphere. So you're trying to do different things with it. I guess it's still a similar sort of tool, but and I'm back into fantasy at the moment, and that really that can, whether you're going for a dark or sort of a more traditional lighter fantasy, that can be very important. The way you come across, you can't sort of apply the same process to every single plot because it won't feel right. You've got to make sure that if you're writing a more violent, darker fantasy, that everything needs to kind of come along with that. And if it doesn't, it needs to be having a purpose. Like, it's got to be standing in a stark opposition to everything else in the book. So yeah, it's definitely very important, regardless of genre. Probably not as important as horror, because horror needs a lot of the atmosphere to provide tension and feelings of fear and dread and whatnot, which is not quite my area, but yeah, it's still definitely something you've got to think very strongly about.
I mean, for me, like, it's one of those things that often I'll get a story idea that starts from a setting, as it were. So like, you guys, anyone who knows my stuff probably knows that I tend to write in quite diverse settings because I'm quite lucky that I get to travel quite a bit. And often I'll be in a place and that is where the story begins. So like when Katie, you say like, and Cindy as well, like setting is the first character, like really, it really is like, okay, here's character number one and it is this place. And what's going to happen here. So yeah, I mean, absolutely crucial for me and my process completely.
And Steph, I know it is for you, but go ahead and talk about it. But I don't know that I've read something of yours that I didn't think, okay, the atmosphere is a character here.
I think it's partly the nature of the sort of subgenres that I write, folk horror and the gothic side. And I think within folk horror, it's very much that the landscape, the setting is a character, because the horror is often as a result of the relationship of the community with the land, and the horror is a result of that, whether it's to fulfill some sort of contract with the whatever deity rules the land, or for their community to prosper. But it's always in response to that, as to whether the soil's fertile and the village or community will survive. There's always that aspect of it. But I've just been reading Gormenghast by Melvin Peake. I've read it before, and I remember reading it years ago, and I've just started rereading it. I've read the first one, Titus Groan, and I'm on to Gormenghast itself now. And I'd forgotten how much the actual castle, this great big stone edifice, is a character in its own right. Everything, it's grey, it's brooding, it's solid, and that translates into the people themselves. When they're almost described in terms of slabs of stone rather than slabs of meat. But for something that talks about atmosphere and setting, that book is absolutely amazing. That, I mean, in the first one, you've got this cook called Swelter from the kitchens, this massive body. And when I first read the book, it was during a very hot summer. And I remember it's because I'd seen the series, I think it was on BBC Two at the time. This was back in the 80s. And it was just, there was heat outside. Heat seemed to come out of the telly. And when I picked up the book and started reading what was going on in the kitchens, and it just felt so hot and claustrophobic. I thought, that is a masterclass in atmosphere and setting, and I'm just loving going back into that. So, and that is, I don't know what genre you would actually call Gormenghast, fantasy, or I don't know. It's a literary work, but it's the character names like Flay and Oh, as I say, Swelter and Steerpike, they're just like Dickensian names, but in this massive castle. So if anyone's not read it, yeah, it's quite a massive tome. It's about that thick because I got all 3 books in one go. But I would say read it because just the greyness, the solidity of that castle, it's alive. It doesn't go anywhere, but it's alive and it feeds into all these characters' lives. And that is a sort of class act in my opinion.
You know, it's just occurred to me that that's the kind of book that I prefer more than anything, is setting as a character. And it makes me wonder, it just makes me wonder, is that normal? Like, are there people who would prefer character over setting? There must be.
Well,
No. I mean, there must be, but I don't know. I think when I think of all of the books that I would say, like my favorite books, even going back to childhood, I can't think of one where it didn't have that kind of heavy feel to it.
well, I mean, and I think Paul brought up a very good point. A lot of that depends on the genre. Like in sci-fi, you really, and probably even fantasy to a point, that's not the point of the story. It's more about the ideas and the wonder, the discovery of things.
Well, yeah.
Mysteries, you can have, I guess, setting where it's its own thing, but really you're more about the puzzle, the crime, who did it, what
Yeah,
happened.
but don't you
what's
think
going
that
on.
world building is an important part of fantasy and sci-fi?
Yes.
Yes,
I mean, yes,
yeah.
absolutely, but it's still coming at it from a different standpoint.
I mean, it is
think.
different.
I mean,
Instead of a heaviness, it could be light and wonder, or just different, like stories that take place in space. They're just different. They're not necessarily ominous, but the atmosphere, I mean, the setting is still a significant part of the book.
well,
We
it
can
depends
talk.
on the
We're going to talk
story.
about this all week here now. I
Exactly.
can feel it. I can feel it
Well,
coming. Sorry, you guys had to be a part of this, but I hope you're ready. Like, this is now we're going to take apart the whole science fiction bookshelf and talk about it, book
well,
by book, book by book.
I mean, I would think with science fiction, it's more about the ideas and what's
Yeah.
going on. I mean, as the plot or as the idea of the story.
All right, Paul, get in on this.
Okay.
I think, but here's what I'm thinking. Like, I'm listening to what you're saying, but I'm thinking about Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land. And I think that the reason that story works so well is the time period it's written to be in. Like,
But
part of the setting.
Is the setting important, or is it more about the philosophical ideas?
Well, no, I'm not saying one's more important than the other. I'm just saying that I think the
We're gonna-
setting.
Listen, after this is
Right, I'm
over,
sorry
we're
you
gonna
guys all get to be a
arguing
part of
all
this
night.
now. Now it's the Heather and
So-
Steve show.
right.
We're glad that you got to come along.
Okay,
But
yeah.
I think that though, I mean, like, listen, you could set Stranger in a Strange Land in 1950. You could set it in 1990, and you're right. The important part is the philosophy of it. But I think the setting still adds to the story. I think it still has a feeling of its own, kind of like the characters. Paul, back me up here. I think that there's an importance to it, though.
Yeah.
I don't
Weigh
know.
in, Paul.
Yeah,
Somebody
I
weigh-
think setting is probably the more important way of presenting that. The last piece that I put, the self-published piece I've got out at the moment, it was very much inspired from the concept of when you see these big fantasy set pieces, these big space stations and anything. I was always wondering about, what's life for the guy, the little normal person behind one of those thousands of windows or whatever. And that was kind of that sort of idea of being a small part aside from the big adventures and the sense of sort of longing that creates. That was very much a founding sort of concept for the book, and that's where it got its fuel from. It might not be the theme that carries it, sort of does carry it all the way through the book, but it's not, it's the conception of it comes from that sense, the emotions that you bring up from those sort of feelings, the idea of wanting to be out in the bigger world rather than a small part tucked away in the corner. So yeah, I think it's got a lot to do with that.
Yeah, and I think, and Steph in the private chat brought up Terry Pratchett's Discworld, in the fantasy settings, and that's another great example. Tatooine. Oh, feelings of isolation and desolation. Tatooine, right? That's right.
Yeah, I can't spell for the life of me. I'm so sorry. I was trying to say Tatooine.
Right.
Tatooine. Yeah. No.
No.
Tatooine.
Tatooine is a planet in Star Wars.
Yeah. But I don't know. I think there is. I don't know. I think world building really is maybe important in all the places. Like I even think, boy, this is going to be an unpopular conversation, perhaps in this group. Right. But even in romance novels, setting can play an important part.
It could. Yeah.
I was thinking about the fact that like the settings we're all talking about here are quite sort of lushly painted settings, like for example in Man in Winter. But then I tried to think about sort of stories I've enjoyed where that hasn't been the case. And it's normally been something like where the setting is really minimalist. But even then, like the constraints of that setting and kind of like the absence of detail has its own influence on the story as well. So I think even in that context, it's still, for me, is like a massively important part of like what I get out of that story. So
because there's a feeling in a minimalist setting. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Like it creates
or like a confined space or something like that. Yeah.
Well, okay. Like
I'm gonna go all week, babe. Like, get ready. It's Tuesday or Wednesday. What day is it?
Here's one thing I would say. Like, okay, Ray Bradbury. Okay. He's one of my favorite writers, of any genre, period. If you read like the Martian Chronicles, sure, setting plays a very strong role there. It's almost like its own thing.
Yeah.
But it's not quite the same as when you read The Haunting of Hill House.
Okay, so I think it's different.
There, the setting is very.
I don't think it's less important,
but foremost and very real.
I understand what you're trying to say.
Sorry, Katie, for derailing.
Right, I understand what you're trying to say. I do think you're a little wrong, but I do understand what you're trying to say. But I think that, I do think, I mean, you have a point. Like it is, like Paul had said earlier, there's a different feeling. Like there's a different point you're trying to make with setting, even if it's a setting like its own character.
Isaac Asimov's Foundation series.
Oh, let's go.
Okay.
Let's go.
It's all about the ideas of the future. It's about the ideas of a civilization developing. Does any one setting in there have more importance? Is it the setting that's important, or is it the ideas of how things develop and move along? And
we can fight about this off screen.
Yeah, we'll fight later.
Well, we'll fight about this at dinner. But but I do think, I mean, like I think that's one of the reasons why horror is such an enjoyable genre, because horror does rely on even the quiet settings, right? You rely on a certain amount of tension that the setting creates. Like in A Man in Winter, to me, part of the tension is, is Art at his old house that he lived in with Molly, or is he in his new bungalow? And
right.
I think they're in the same town, if I remember correctly. It's this, you know what I mean? Like it's just across town. It's not like he's left and gone across the country, right. But they're so different. Like one is a safe place and one is a new foreign place. And so the safe place has been tarnished because it's the place where Molly was in the most danger and he wasn't,
right.
He wasn't able to save her in that time. And so in his new space, he's trying to save her now. But I think I'm not giving away spoilers, but the feeling of those two different places are so vastly different. Like the bungalow place feels, it's his stuff, but it's kind of sterile. You know what I mean? It doesn't have his lifetime of memories with his wife and his children. And so like it's this place where he's existing because he has to, where the place where he lived with Molly is like the safe place. It's like when you're in a safe place, but it's no longer safe because something horrific happens in it. And so, is Jaws horror? I have an agent of Chris. Yes, Jaws is horror. For those of us who saw Jaws as a small child, Jaws is 100% horror.
Well, Alien is horror, but Aliens is sci-fi, and I'll argue and fight that to the.
I mean, we can talk about it later because I feel like you're wrong again.
Just answering Craig.
Right, but I mean, listen. I think it's interesting because really, truly, some of the favorite stories that we think of is like general fiction, or literary fiction are really horror stories. Truly. I mean, Jaws, you don't find Jaws. Here in America, if you want to find the book Jaws, it's in general fiction. It is not in the horror section. And I got to tell you, it should be. It's a terrifying story. Oh boy, here we go. It is. It's a scary story. It's a murdering shark.
Is it a thriller or an adventure? Watch the movie. The most of the.
Well, I mean, like, here's the thing. We can argue about this too. Moby Dick should be in the horror section. Oh, don't start. Don't start.
Okay.
You're a mess today. You're just a mess.
No, we're gonna have words over.
With the Jaws film, you watch the opening scene and you listen to the noises that woman makes when it keeps getting pulled under the water and she keeps sort of catching her breath, and you see if your like stomach doesn't fall out your bum afterwards.
Yeah.
Full on horror.
Jaws.
I
Jaws.
think it's a thriller.
I'm going to make a point. I'm going to make a point if I can, because I haven't spoken at all today. Jaws is, hi Katie, Jaws is the ultimate horror book because it can really, really, really happen. In fact, it just did in Egypt 2 months ago. So it is ultimately the horror book, and it should definitely be in the horror section of your local bookstore. My opinion.
Agreed. I think thrillers can be horror. I think sometimes we try to paint horror with too narrow of a brush.
And I think if you go back into the 70s, 60s, 70s, they used thriller a lot more. I'm not sure they use horror as a designation in bookstores yet. I think that came in the 80s more. I could be wrong, but there's a lot of stuff that's marked thriller from back then that really is a horror story.
As a child, I don't remember there being a horror section in the Kansas City bookstore, but there was a thriller section.
And it was in general fiction.
Yeah, it was like at the end of general fiction. You had those couple books of thrillers that were also horror, but also like political thrillers or legal thrillers.
While we're on the genre debate, actually, this is something that I wanted to ask Katie about, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Which is like you describe yourself as horror enthusiast, and this story, brilliant, wonderful, yeah, awesome, me too. But this story, like very much, like we said way back at the beginning, you guys, Heather and Steve, would very comfortably fit in the mystery genre, and probably a couple of others actually as well. And then I looked at your other work as well, and it seems like this is like a thematic kind of thing you're writing. Like there's always like horror elements there, but there's also always quite a lot of other stuff going on. So I'm wondering, like when you go to write a story or when you're planning a story, I don't know if you are a planner, like do you start with like a horror focus, or like where does the horror come in? Does genre even become a consideration for you?
I tend to start quite strongly in the horror side of things. That's where all my ideas come from. But I very quickly wander about, kind of like a little pinball in the machine. You sort of bounce around and you bounce off all the different things, and you take something from here and you take something from there. And I do think that genre is it's obviously a term that we all use and we know what we're talking about when we talk about genre. But the best kind of genre is an amalgamation of all the genres. It's like a super genre. Like all the genres got together and had a big genre baby and called it Steve.
They call it mashup here. And I got to tell you, I love a mashup. I mean, give me something that stretches
Or
from
cross genre.
Cross genre. I like mashup better. But give me something that stretches across 2 to 3 different genres. You know, the ones that bookstores are like, how do I market this? Those are like my favorite. I'm like, let's do it. You tell me where you want to put it on the shelf and I'll make sure you've got copies.
It's such a difficult one though when you're a writer, because you're always told to, when you send your books out to publishers and agents, you need to be able to tell them where it sits in the bookstore. And that's so hard sometimes.
Yeah.
When your book just sits everywhere and you can't turn around and say, yeah, my book is for everyone, because
you say the table at the front, like where people first walk in, please. That would be ideal.
Under a big light with a sign.
Exactly.
But it's true, because you know, like even when we go to put a book in, no matter where we list it, they always want to know, they call them categories, but they're really the genres and subgenres you want to try to market the book in. And I mean, like, I get it. Bye, Mickey. I get it, because if you're a brick and mortar bookstore, you've got to sell the book. You want to put it someplace where people who are looking for it are going to find it. And I think one of the great things that happened during the pandemic, which is a weird way to start a sentence, is bookstores that didn't traditionally sell online suddenly found themselves trying to online market, which is very different than brick and mortar marketing. You know, you don't have the same constraints. You don't have the same constraints as brick and mortar marketing, because people will just go to your website and be like, okay, well, what sounds interesting? And they may search by a category or a keyword. But I got to tell you, like, if you go on bookshop.org, and maybe it's just me because of the way I shop and purchase
Right.
books, but like, it's a smorgasbord of everything. You know, I mean, like, I hate to drop the Amazon word, but it's the same thing on Amazon. And
Well,
me and one of the kids share an account, so it is a crazy minefield of what things they will recommend to us.
well, that is one of the nice things I like about Amazon and other online things like that is you can class a book as mystery, horror, and dark fantasy, and it's all in all categories. Unlike a brick and mortar store, well, you can't really put it on 3 different shelves.
Right.
I guess you could, but
Yeah. Yeah. Sharing an Amazon account with, you know, I think they call it the family account, where you have like 2 or 3, is it 2 people on your account in your household or something? But it's, sometimes I open up my Kindle and it'll be like based on what was last downloaded in the family account will be the recommendations. And I'm like, what is happening? And the kid will do the same thing. He's like, Mom, we got to talk about what you're reading. I don't want to see ads for this stuff. But so it is wild. But I think it gave more freedom to the mashups. You know, online ordering kind of gives more, you know, it's easier to market in an online way than book and mortar. And listen, I get it. We dream sometimes of opening a bookstore, and it's the thing, I would have to have a mashup shelf. Like, I would. I know it would be probably unpopular with you, especially because I would probably put most of the books on the mashup shelf. But I think I would have to, because there's so many of them. Jaws is a slasher film with moral commentary and capitalist greed. That may be the best description for Jaws I have ever seen. You don't want to talk about it?
we're gonna.
Oh, it's going to be a good night at the Ventura Vassallo house tonight, people.
Craig, you need to tweet that.
Yeah, but yeah, that'll be a Twitter war. But all right, so Katie, we're getting ready to wrap up. So, is there a reading that you want to do from us from the book?
Yeah, sure. I have my own brick and mortar
Yeah.
copy with me, and it's I've done a whole reading once before, so you may have to bear with my my dyslexic self as I try and stumble my way through a little bit of the second chapter, if that's okay. Cool. So, a hen. Cough, cough, cough. I was sore when I woke up. It took several long minutes of gentle movement before I could convince my fingers to loosen up enough to let go of Molly's dressing gown, and even longer for me to sit up. The dressing gown was the one she had died in. My hand shook as I let go of it, and it fell to the floor. I thought they had destroyed it. Sophie had told me they had thrown it away. What was it doing here? Where had it come from? My bones creaked as I rocked to my feet, and they were still creaking as I shuffled into the kitchen and switched the kettle on. I glanced at the sink and noticed that there seemed to be more dishes than I remembered using waiting to be washed. I'd deal with them later. The stiffness had eased a little by the time I reached the living room, tea in hand. I put the tea on the windowsill and picked up my grabber, another gift from Sophie that had, much to my annoyance, turned out to be quite useful. It was a simple device, a stick with a claw on one end that I could operate from the other. I headed back to the bedroom where the dressing gown was on the floor. The grabber made picking up the gown easy. Lord knows without it, I would have had to have waited several hours for my back to ease up enough for me to be able to bend down that far. Even then, there was never a guarantee I'd make it back to my feet by myself. I had, until my diagnosis, thought that the worst part of getting old was the fact that I struggled to get up and down by myself. Suffice to say that the betrayal of my mind was much worse. The strong possibility that when I passed away, I wouldn't even know who the people at my bedside were was worse than a bad back. I went back to the living room and stood by the window. Taking my tea in hand, I looked out to the front garden and wondered again how Molly's dressing gown had turned up in my bedroom. You should plant hydrangeas, like we had at the cottage. I almost dropped the dressing gown again as I turned behind me. Molly was sitting on the sofa, relaxed and smiling as if she'd spent the morning sitting there watching me faff about making tea. I always loved the hydrangeas, she smiled at me. You should get blue ones. And that is the first time Art sees Molly.
Molly, such a powerful scene. I think that's very good. That's a
She
good.
turns up
that was-
talking about flowers.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant.
All right. Well, as we get ready to go here, I'll also point one last thing to Katie. Is there anything you would like to say to your readers, to your fans, anyone who's read the book, anyone who hasn't read the book yet?
Apart from the obvious, if you haven't read the book, read the book. I promise.
Yeah.
I tried really hard and it's good, hopefully. But probably the most obvious thing, and everyone will be sick to death of hearing it, it's hardly original. But if you've read the book, if you liked it, if you didn't like it, any feedback, I'm always thrilled to receive any kind of feedback. Feedback that tells me the book was good just makes my ego swell and makes me want to write more. And feedback that says, yeah, your book was okay, but this could have been better, then it makes me a better writer. And feedback that says, yeah, your book was shit, well, that boosts my numbers. So thanks.
Any review. Yeah.
I'm
So,
happy.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's true of all writers. Just review. So, all right, guys. Well, I think that's our wrap up. Amy, I think we're all out. Thank you guys so much for joining us to celebrate Katie's anniversary. I can't believe it's been a year since our first standalone book came out. We had just done anthologies up until this point.
Yeah. Well, we had done some reprints before then. This was our
the
first,
reprints from the
this
closed
was our first
press.
brand new novella.
Yeah,
so,
brand new. Had to read it from submission.
Yes, Stephanie and Kev would actually be the first, but
That's true. They were the first. I think Stephanie is actually the first, and then Kev. We did one or two of Steph's, and then Kev's, and then Stewartville, Prisoners of Stewartville, also.
Stewartville,
Yeah. So, yeah, that's good. But yeah, this was the one that we had put out submissions for and chosen from a bunch of. This was also the one that Steve edited, and I don't know. Some of you know the story about how I lay down on the floor in the kitchen and cried because Steve tore up a whole section, like several pages of a chapter, and I was like, "You're destroying the story. You're killing me. You can't rewrite that part." And then Katie agreed with Steve. This is what we agreed. I said, okay, send it to the author.
Why?
And if she says no way, then you back off and it stays. And if she says, fine, let me work with it, I'll let it go. And she wrote back and she's like, yeah, let me work with that. I think, yeah. And I was like, what? And, but I mean, like, it was a knockdown,
she almost
drag out.
She almost wouldn't talk to me for a couple
Oh,
of
it was
days.
very dramatic. It was very dramatic. That's when we decided that I would step away from the editing part of the stories, that I would be involved in acquisitions and final reads, looking for proofs, which is hysterical since I'm dyslexic. So, but you know, I can spot the glaring things usually, like there's too many spaces between these words. But that was pretty funny because and he is the editor between the both of us. And so, I mean, like, he's the one who has editing experience, but I was convinced he was destroying the story and therefore destroying me. But it turns out he was right and Katie was right. And when she rewrote that section, it was brilliant. And I was like, well, damn.
That's all right.
Yeah. I guess I'll keep managing the money. I'm good at that part. All right.
Well, thank you, Amy, for hosting us again here today. And
Yeah. Thanks, Katie, for trusting your manuscript with us. It was quite a
Oh,
wild
thank
ride.
you. Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Great reading as well. Loved it. Brilliant.
Oh,
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Awesome.
everybody.
Bye,
Joining us.
everybody.
bye.